I still remember the sound that morning, gravel crunching under tires, an engine roaring, a dry snap as my private property sign broke clean in half. A gleaming white SUV tore through the fence line, mud spraying up in arcs, an HOA logo plastered big on the driver's door. Behind the wheel sat Brenda Mallory, queen of Whispering Pines, or, as everyone else called her, the HOA Karen. She waved through her tinted window, the kind of wave that said, "You can't do anything about this." 8 years of farming, and I'd never seen anyone treat my land like a public road. But that morning, watching the tire tracks carve through the path I'd sweated to maintain, something in me snapped along with that sign. Brenda wanted a shortcut through my property. I'd give her a straight shot into the mud. Before we dig into this, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your city and the local time in the comments. You're going to want to hear how this ends. But before Monday morning, 7:42 a.m., early September, I stood in the middle of my south pasture holding a lukewarm Yeti of coffee, staring at 2 parallel ruts carved straight through my hayfield. The old engineer in me kicked in automatically. I crouched and ran my hand over the compressed earth. Wide tires, aggressive tread pattern, approximately 5 feet of separation between tracks. SUV, luxury class, based on the weight distribution. Definitely not farm equipment. Definitely not county maintenance. The tracks ran in a perfect straight line from the sagging barbed wire at my eastern boundary all the way to the county road on the west side. 320 feet, give or take. Whoever did this had driven with purpose and confidence. This wasn't someone lost. This was someone who'd mapped a route and decided my 40 acres were their personal shortcut. I'd owned this land for 8 years, bought it with life insurance money after Sarah died from cancer. Before that, I was a construction engineer in Houston. After she passed, I couldn't stay in that city. Too many memories. So I came here and taught myself to farm hay. The work was honest, and the rules were simple. Fence lines meant something. Property deeds meant something. Inside the barn, I fired up my laptop and pulled the survey plat from my property tax file. I zoomed in and traced the boundary lines with my cursor. 40 acres, precisely measured and legally recorded. 0 easements, 0 rights of way. Just my name, Ray Collins, on a deed going back to 2017. I took a screenshot and saved it to a folder I'd labeled Property Documentation years ago, back when I was still thinking like an engineer. On the wall above the desk, my old certificate hung next to a photo of Sarah in her garden, smiling under her wide-brimmed hat. 2 tracks meant at least 2 trips, and 2 trips meant this wasn't an accident. That evening, around 5:15, I was kneeling by a broken water pump in the east pasture when I heard the engine, low and aggressive, accelerating hard. I looked up just in time to see a white Mercedes SUV barrel through the gap in my fence line where I'd welded an old gate shut 2 years ago. The wire had sagged just enough for someone who didn't care about scratches. I grabbed my phone and stood up fast. The Mercedes was already tearing across the field at maybe 35 miles per hour. I managed to snap 2 quick photos before it roared past. Close enough that I got a clear look at the driver. Middle-aged woman, brown bob cut, oversized sunglasses, Starbucks cup in one hand, and phone pressed to her ear with the other. She didn't slow down, didn't even glance in my direction, just kept going, trailing a thick cloud of red dust that hung in the air long after the engine noise faded toward the county road. I looked down at my phone screen. The photos were slightly blurred from the motion, but good enough. I zoomed in on the license plate in the second shot. HOA 1, vanity plate, custom. I zoomed in further on the door panel. Sure enough, a small magnetic sign, Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. The woman in the driver's seat had been smiling. I walked the tire tracks west as the sun dropped lower, my shadow stretching long on the flattened hay. The engineering part of my brain cataloged the damage automatically. Approximately 200 bales worth of crushed forage, maybe $800 in lost revenue. The tracks cut straight through without deviation, which meant the driver knew exactly where she was going and had done this route before. At the western edge, near the county road, I found a piece of chrome trim lying in the grass, about 3 inches long, stamped with the Mercedes logo. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. Evidence of contact. I slipped it into my shirt pocket. Behind me, across the fence line, Meadowbrook Estates gleamed in the evening light. Perfect rows of identical houses, manicured lawns, synchronized sprinklers, the kind of neighborhood where people paid monthly fees to ensure matching mailboxes. But someone from that neighborhood had just driven through my land like it was a public highway. Twice. In one day. I pulled out my phone and opened a browser. 3 searches later, I had a name and address. Brenda Mallory, 2455 Meadowlark Lane. President of Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. Her professional profile showed her standing in front of a white Mercedes GLE with her arms crossed and a confident smile. The kind of smile that said she was used to getting her way. I walked back to the barn and set the chrome piece on my desk next to the laptop. Then I poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey and sat down to think. Tomorrow, I'll go talk to Brenda Mallory. I'd figure out what came next. Thursday afternoon, I drove my F-150 into Meadowbrook Estates for the first time. The entrance had a brick gateway reading, "Preserving Community Excellence since 2021. Inside, every house looked identical. 2-story colonials, beige siding, matching black mailboxes. Less like a neighborhood, more like a stage set. On 2455 Meadowlark Lane, halfway down the main loop. The house was slightly larger than its neighbors, with fake Greek columns and a lawn so perfect it looked artificial. A small wooden sign near the driveway said, "HOA President, preserving your investment." The white Mercedes sat in the driveway, freshly washed, not a speck of mud left on it. Parked on the street, walked up the concrete path, and rang the doorbell. Chimes echoed inside. After a moment, the door opened, and there she was, Brenda Mallory in person, wearing black athleisure wear that probably cost more than my truck payment, holding an iPad in one manicured hand. She looked at me with the kind of smile customer service reps use when they're about to say no. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice pleasant but hollow. "Afternoon, Ms. Mallory," I said, keeping my tone level. "I'm Ray Collins. I own the farm on your eastern border. I wanted to talk to you about the fact that you've been driving through my property." Her smile didn't move, but her eyes did, flicking past me to my truck and then back to my face. She tilted her head. "You're Collins. I've been using that route for a few weeks now. It saves me about 10 minutes getting to the county road. And honestly, it's just an empty field. You're not even using it for anything." I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my voice steady. "It's not empty. It's hay pasture, and it's private property. I put up a sign last week asking people not to trespass. A sign." She waved dismissively. "I didn't see any sign, and there's no easement listed in county records. Technically, it's a gray area." That's when I took a slow breath. "An easement only exists if the property owner grants one. I never gave permission. That's trespassing. I'm asking you to stop." Brenda's expression shifted. The pleasant mask dropped, and something colder slid into place. She crossed her arms, the iPad tucked against her chest like armor. "Mr. Collins, do you know what property values are in Meadowbrook? Every house here is worth at least $400,000. Your farm brings down the aesthetic of the area. Some residents have even asked if the HOA could purchase your land to expand our community park. We'd offer you a fair price. Of course, I'm not selling," I said. "Then maybe you should think about being a better neighbor," she said, her voice losing all warmth now. "That route I use is practical and efficient. Your field just sits there. If you really cared about being neighborly, you'd see that allowing a harmless shortcut benefits the community." I stared at her for a long moment. The engineering part of my brain wanted to explain property law, trespassing statutes, and liability. But the human part of me was starting to understand something darker. Brenda Mallory didn't care about the law. She cared about convenience, and she believed her position as HOA president gave her some kind of authority over the world outside her gates. "Ms. Mallory," I said slowly, "I'm not asking you to be neighborly. I'm telling you that you don't have permission to drive on my land. If you keep doing it, I'll take legal action." She laughed, actually laughed, a sharp little sound that felt like a slap. "Legal action? Good luck with that. Mr. Collins, I'm sure you can find a lawyer who works for hay bales. But let me give you some advice. This community has resources. We have attorneys on retainer. If you want to start a fight over a dirt path, you're going to lose. So maybe just let it go." She stepped back and started to close the door. I put my hand up, not touching it, just holding the space. "I'm not looking for a fight," I said, "but I'm also not letting this go. That's my land. You need to stay off it." Her face hardened into something cold and polished, like marble. "Then I guess you'll do what you have to do. And so will I." She shut the door, and I heard the deadbolt click into place. I stood on her porch for 3 seconds, my hand still raised. Then I lowered it, turned around, and walked back to my truck. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something stranger and quieter. Disbelief. I'd spent 8 years in this county dealing with co-op managers and feed suppliers and county inspectors, and every single one of them had operated with a baseline level of respect. Disagree on price, disagree on terms. Fine. But nobody had ever looked me in the eye and told me my property rights didn't matter. I started the truck and drove out of Meadowbrook slowly, watching the identical houses slide past my windows. At the entrance, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Somewhere behind those walls, Brenda Mallory was probably already back on her iPad, managing her kingdom of covenants and mailbox colors. And tomorrow morning at 7:40, she'd drive through my field again. That night, Brenda posted on the Meadowbrook Estates community group online. I didn't see it right away, because I wasn't part of the group and didn't even know it existed. But a week later, someone would forward me a screenshot. The post read, "Heads up, neighbors. The farmer next door confronted me at my home today with aggressive language about a harmless shortcut I've been using. This kind of hostility is exactly why we need to protect our community values. Please be cautious if you interact with him." Within 2 hours, it had 47 reactions and 23 comments, most of them variations on "Stay safe, Brenda," and "Some people just don't understand progress." One person wrote "Classic rural intimidation tactics," and another said, "He's probably trying to extort money." I didn't know about any of this yet. But the next day, when I went to the farmer's co-op to buy feed, the cashier who usually chatted with me about the weather just scanned my items in silence and didn't say, "Have a good one," when I left. And that's when I started to realize that Brenda Mallory's fight wasn't just going to be about tire tracks. I drove home with the windows down, the hot September air rushing through the cab. Behind me in the distance, I could hear the faint hiss of Meadowbrook's sprinkler system cycling on in perfect synchronized rhythm, watering lawns that didn't need it. The sound faded as I turned onto the county road, replaced by the low hum of my engine and the crunch of gravel under my tires. My tires, on my road, heading back to my land. Tomorrow, I'd figure out what came next. Saturday morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. with a plan forming in my head. Not revenge. Engineers don't do revenge. We do solutions. And the solution to someone repeatedly trespassing on your property isn't anger or confrontation. It's documentation and leverage. I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad, and started working. I pulled up my property deed. 40 acres. Boundaries clearly defined. Recorded in 2017. No easements, no exceptions. I printed 2 copies. Then I searched Texas Penal Code section 30.05. Criminal trespass. Clear statute. A person commits an offense if they enter property without consent, after notice. I'd already provided notice twice. I opened a fresh page in my legal pad and started sketching. The engineering habit never really left me. I drew my property boundaries to scale, marked the fence lines, and traced the path of Brenda's tire tracks in red pencil. Then I added a dotted line running perpendicular across her route, right through the middle of the south pasture. Next to it I wrote, "Proposed irrigation trench, 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep." Underneath that, I added, "Legal justification, improve drainage for south pasture per agricultural exemption." The idea had been sitting in the back of my mind since Thursday night, but now I could see it clearly. Brazos County gave me an agricultural exemption on my property taxes because I actively farmed the land. Part of that exemption allowed me to make improvements for irrigation and drainage without needing special permits. If I dug a trench to manage water flow across my south pasture, that was completely legal. And if that trench happened to run directly across the route Brenda had been using as her personal shortcut, that was just good farm planning. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the sketch. This wasn't a trap. This was infrastructure. But it would sure as hell make her think twice about driving 40 miles per hour across someone else's land. That afternoon, I drove to the Brazos County Sheriff's Office. I needed to understand exactly where I stood legally before I did anything else. Deputy Eric Harding was working the front desk. I'd known Eric for 6 years, ever since we'd volunteered together on a wildfire response crew back in 2019. He was good people, the kind of cop who actually cared about solving problems instead of just writing tickets. Up to shake my hand. Long time. What brings you in? I need some advice about trespassing law. Someone's been driving across my property repeatedly, even after I asked them to stop and put up signs. His expression shifted to something more serious. He gestured to a chair. Sit. Tell me what's going on. I laid it out for him. The tire tracks, the confrontation at Brenda's house, the vanity plate, the repeat violations. I showed him the photos on my phone with the timestamps clearly visible. Eric listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or jotting something down on a notepad. When I finished, he sat back and tapped his pen against the desk. Okay, so legally, you're solid. You've got the deed, you've got survey documentation, you've got clear signage, and you've got photographic evidence of repeated violations. Technically, this is a Class C misdemeanor under Texas law, but here's the reality. We don't usually arrest people for trespassing unless there's property damage or a credible threat. Has she caused any measurable harm? Crushed hay, I said. About 200 bales worth, maybe $800 in lost revenue. That makes it a civil matter, Eric said. You could sue her in small claims court for damages, or... He paused and gave me a look that was somewhere between official and friendly. You could take steps to physically prevent her from accessing your property, as long as it's legal on your end. Fencing, gates, barriers, anything that serves a legitimate agricultural purpose. Like an irrigation trench, I asked. Eric's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. If you need drainage on your south pasture, and you've got the ag exemption to back it up, then yeah, that's well within your rights. Just make sure you document everything. Photos, dates, measurements. If this ever does go to court, you want to prove that you acted reasonably and legally at every step. I stood up and shook his hand again. Appreciate it. Eric. Ray, he said, his voice dropping lower. One more thing. People like this, HOA types, they don't stop easily. If you do this, she's going to escalate. She'll probably try to make you look like the bad guy, so cover your ass, document everything, and if she does something stupid, call me. Will do, I said. Sunday morning, I drove to the farm supply store and bought 2 rolls of barbed wire, 10 T-posts, a roll of yellow caution tape, and a reflective sign that read, "Danger open trench ahead." The cashier rang it up without comment. Just another farmer buying materials. I loaded everything into the truck bed and drove home, already running calculations in my head. 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, 320 feet long. I could rent a mini excavator from the county co-op for $150 a day. 2 days of work, maybe 3 if I took my time and did it right. Back at the barn, I pulled out an old trail camera I'd bought years ago for monitoring the feed shed. I checked the batteries, swapped in a fresh SD card, and mounted it on a post near where Brenda's tracks entered my property, angled to capture the full route. Motion activated, timestamp enabled, perfect documentation. If Brenda kept driving through my land, I'd have video evidence of every single violation with date and timestamps that would hold up in any courtroom in Texas. I walked back to the barn and sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and called up the contact information for the Brazos County Extension Office. I needed to make one more phone call before I started digging. Agricultural improvements were legal, but I wanted documentation from the county saying I'd consulted with them about drainage planning, not because I needed permission, just because I wanted one more piece of paper in my file proving I'd done everything by the book. The extension agent I spoke with was helpful and asked good questions. A trench across the south pasture would help with water management during heavy rains. Yes, 3 feet by 2 feet was a reasonable size for that purpose. I didn't need a permit as long as I wasn't affecting any shared watershed or county drainage systems. He offered to email me a summary of our conversation for my records. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat there for a long moment, looking at the sketch I'd drawn that morning. The red line cuts across Brenda's route. The notes about depths and dimensions. The words legal justification were underlined twice. Sarah's voice echoed in my head, something she used to say when I was overthinking a problem. You don't have to win every argument. You just have to protect what's yours. I closed the laptop and stood up. Tomorrow morning I'd rent the excavator, and by tomorrow night, Brenda Mallory's shortcut was going to require a detour. Monday morning at 6 a.m., I picked up the mini excavator from the county co-op. It was a compact Kubota, small enough to maneuver through pasture without tearing up too much ground, but powerful enough to move serious dirt. The rental clerk, an older guy named Frank who'd sold me hay equipment before, looked at the paperwork and nodded. "Drainage project?" he asked. "South pasture floods every time we get heavy rain," I said. It wasn't a lie. The land held water after storms. I just hadn't bothered to fix it until now. "Smart," Frank said. "You want it back on Wednesday?" "Thursday morning," I said. "I'll take my time and do it right." I drove the excavator home on a flatbed trailer, unloaded it near the barn, and spent the next 20 minutes double-checking the hydraulics and controls. Everything worked smoothly. Then I walked out to the south pasture with a can of orange spray paint and marked the trench line on the ground. 320 feet, running perpendicular to Brenda's tire tracks, positioned right in the middle of her shortcut route. I measured twice, marked clearly, and took photos of the painted line from multiple angles with timestamps visible. Then I climbed into the excavator cab, started the engine, and got to work. Digging a trench is methodical. You set your bucket angle, lower it into the earth, and let the machine work. The Kubota's diesel engine rumbled steadily. I worked in sections, 5 feet at a time, keeping width and depth consistent. The work was hot, loud, and strangely satisfying. Dirt piled in neat berms on either side. By noon on Monday, I'd completed about a third of the length. I stopped for lunch, drank a gallon of water, and checked the trail camera footage on my phone using the camera's wireless app. Sure enough, at 7:41 that morning, Brenda's white Mercedes had come tearing through the gap in my fence line. The camera had captured her perfectly. Clear shot of the license plate. Clear shot of her face through the windshield. Timestamp and date stamped in the corner. She hadn't even slowed down when she passed the excavator parked near the barn, just kept going, crossed the field at her usual speed, and disappeared onto the county road. I saved the clip and backed it up to my cloud storage. She'd driven through my property 11 times in the past 2 weeks. I had video evidence of every single one. By Wednesday afternoon, the trench was complete. 320 feet long, 3 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, running in a perfectly straight line across the south pasture. I'd used a laser level to ensure a slight gradient, about 2% slope, so water would actually drain west toward a natural low point near the county road. This wasn't just for show. It was functional infrastructure that would genuinely help with water management, but it also happened to sit directly in the path of Brenda's shortcut. I returned the excavator on Thursday morning, then drove to the hardware store and bought reflective warning signs. 2 large ones that read, "Danger open trench ahead," in bold red letters on yellow backgrounds. I mounted them on T-posts at both ends of the trench, 50 feet back from the actual edge, high enough to be visible from 100 yards away. Then I strung yellow caution tape along both sides of the trench and placed 4 orange traffic cones at the corners. When I finished, I stood back and looked at the setup. It was impossible to miss. The signs were reflective and positioned well in advance. The caution tape was bright yellow and ran the full length. The cones were standard Department of Transportation size. Anyone approaching at a reasonable speed would have plenty of time to see the warnings and stop. It was a clearly marked construction zone on private property. I took photographs of everything. The signs, the tape, the cones, the trench itself. I documented the distances from the warning signs to the trench edge. I photographed the whole scene from the angle Brenda would be approaching. Then I uploaded everything to my cloud storage with file names that included the date and description. Thursday evening, I organized my documentation into folders: property records, trespassing evidence, trench construction, communication attempts, each with dates and descriptions. If this went to court, anyone could understand the timeline in 5 minutes. Then I drafted an email to Deputy Eric Harding with the subject line, "Trespassing Incident Documentation Update." I attached the property deed, the survey plat, photos of my warning signs from 2 weeks ago, and the trail camera footage showing repeated violations. I explained that I'd completed agricultural drainage work on my south pasture and installed appropriate warning signage. I mentioned Brenda Mallory by name, included her address and license plate number, and noted that I expected her to either finally respect the no trespassing notices or potentially have an accident if she continued to ignore clearly posted warnings. I read the email twice, made sure the tone was factual and unemotional, and hit send. Eric replied 30 minutes later. "Got your email. Reviewed everything. Legally. You're rock solid. You've documented this better than most police reports I see. Keep me posted if anything happens. And Ray, seriously, good work on the documentation. Most people don't think this far ahead." I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. Outside the barn, I could hear cicadas starting their evening chorus. The sun was dropping low, painting the pasture in gold light. The trench ran like a dark seam across the field, sharp-edged and geometric against the natural landscape. It looked exactly like what it was, a boundary, a line that said this far and no further. Tomorrow was Friday. If Brenda stayed on her usual schedule, she'd be driving through my property at 7:40 a.m., and this time she'd have a choice. She could see the signs, recognize the warning, and turn around. Or she could ignore them like she'd ignored everything else and find out what happens when you treat someone else's boundary like a suggestion. I walked outside and stood at the edge of the trench, looking east toward Meadowbrook Estates. Lights were starting to come on in the windows over there. Landscape lighting, porch lights, the soft glow of television screens. It looked peaceful and orderly from this distance. But I knew better now. I knew what lived behind that facade of manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. I went back inside, poured myself a drink, and waited for morning. Friday morning, I woke up at 6:30 and made coffee. I didn't have to wait long. At 7:38, I heard the engine. That familiar growl, coming from the east side of my property, is accelerating hard. I grabbed my phone and walked out onto the barn porch. The sun was just clearing the horizon, painting everything in sharp golden light. Perfect visibility. The white Mercedes came tearing through the gap in my fence line, doing at least 40 miles per hour. I could see Brenda clearly through the windshield, phone pressed to her ear, coffee cup in the center console, sunglasses on even though the sun was behind her. She wasn't looking at the road ahead. She was looking at her phone screen. I raised my phone and started recording video. The Mercedes ate up the distance fast. 200 feet, 150. At 100 feet, the first warning sign should have been clearly visible in her peripheral vision. At 75 feet, it should have been impossible to miss. The yellow and red reflective surface caught the morning sun like a beacon. Brenda didn't slow down. 50 feet from the trench. She finally glanced up from her phone. I saw her eyes widen behind the sunglasses. Saw her hand drop the phone into her lap. Saw her foot slam on the brake. The Mercedes anti-lock system kicked in with a grinding mechanical scream. Rubber shrieked against dry grass and dirt. The vehicle slewed slightly sideways, tires fighting for traction on the loose soil. But physics doesn't care about panic. The Mercedes had too much speed and not enough distance. It hit the edge of the trench, doing maybe 25 miles per hour. The front wheels dropped into the gap with a sound like a bass drum being kicked. Metal scraped stone. The airbags deployed with 2 sharp pops. The rear end of the vehicle lifted slightly, and then settled as the chassis bottomed out on the far edge of the trench, the undercarriage catching on dirt and rock. The engine revved once, spinning uselessly in empty air, and then died. Dust hung in the air like fog. The Mercedes sat at a 40-degree angle, front end buried in the trench, back end pointing at the sky. Steam or dust rose from under the hood. Both airbags had deployed, filling the front cabin with white powder. I stopped recording and ran toward the vehicle, already dialing 911 with my other hand. Whatever else was true, I wasn't going to stand there and watch someone get hurt on my land. I reached the Mercedes in maybe 15 seconds. Brenda was moving inside, pushing at the deflated airbag, coughing from the powder. I pulled on the driver's door, but it was jammed. wedged against the angle of the trench. "Are you hurt?" I called through the window. She turned and looked at me. Her face was covered in white airbag residue. Her mascara had run in dark streaks down her cheeks. For a second, she just stared, eyes wide and unfocused. Then something snapped into place, and her expression twisted into rage. "You did this!" she screamed, her voice muffled by the window glass. "You dug this hole to trap me. You tried to kill me." "I dug an agricultural drainage trench on my property," I said, keeping my voice level. "There are warning signs 50 feet back. Did you see them?" "I didn't see anything," she yelled. "You put this here to hurt me. This is attempted murder." I held up my phone, showing her that I was still recording. "Ms. Mallory, there are 2 reflective warning signs, yellow caution tape, and 4 traffic cones. They're all clearly visible. Did you see any of them? Before you entered my property?" Her mouth opened and closed. She looked past me toward the warning sign, now clearly visible in the morning light, then back at me. "I was on the phone," she said, and her voice had shifted from rage to something more defensive. "I was distracted. But you knew I used this route. You did this on purpose. I warned you 2 weeks ago to stop trespassing," I said. "I asked you politely to stay off my land. You refused. This trench is legal agricultural infrastructure on private property with clearly posted warnings. You chose to ignore the warnings, and you chose to drive across my land without permission. That's on you." The 911 dispatcher came on the line. "911, what's your emergency?" Brenda lunged for her own phone, found it on the floor mat, and started dialing. I stepped back and spoke to my dispatcher. "This is Ray Collins at 4120 County Road 17. There's been a single vehicle accident on my property. The driver is conscious and appears uninjured, but her vehicle is stuck in a drainage trench. She's calling for help too. You'll probably get 2 calls about the same incident." I could hear Brenda through the window, her voice high and frantic. "Yes, I need police. A man dug a trap on a road and I drove into it. My car is destroyed. This is assault. I want him arrested." The dispatcher on my end asked if I needed an ambulance. I looked at Brenda, who was moving fine, just trapped in the vehicle. "I don't think so," I said. "But send a deputy. This is going to need a police report." Deputy Eric Harding arrived 20 minutes later with another deputy I didn't know, a woman named Chen. By that time, a small crowd had gathered on the Meadowbrook side of the fence line. Maybe 8 or 10 people, mostly in workout clothes or bathrobes, standing at the property boundary and recording on their phones. Someone had probably posted about it in the community group. Eric walked up to me first. He looked at the Mercedes, looked at the warning signs and caution tape, looked at the trench, and then looked at me with an expression that was very carefully neutral. He said quietly, "Walk me through what happened." I showed him the video I'd recorded, showed him the photos I'd taken on Wednesday of the completed trench and warning signage, showed him the trail camera footage from the past 2 weeks documenting Brenda's repeated trespassing. He watched it all without commenting, occasionally nodding. Then he walked over to inspect the warning signs. Deputy Chen had already pulled Brenda out through the passenger door and was taking her statement. I could hear fragments of it. "He did this on purpose. I use this route every day. There was no warning. He's trying to hurt me." Eric measured the distance from the warning sign to the trench edge with a tape measure from his patrol car. 52 feet. He took photos of the signs, the caution tape, the cones. He walked the perimeter of the trench, examining it from different angles. Then he came back to where I was standing. He said, "I need you to understand something. Ms. Mallory is claiming you built a trap to damage her vehicle. She's threatening to press charges for criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. What's your response to that?" I handed him a printed copy of my email to the county extension office, the one where they'd confirmed my right to dig drainage trenches under my agricultural exemption. "This is legal agricultural infrastructure on private property. It's clearly marked with DOT standard warning signage. Ms. Mallory has been trespassing on my land repeatedly for 2 weeks, despite verbal warnings and posted signs. I have video documentation of 14 separate violations. She chose to ignore the warnings, and she chose to trespass. That's not my fault." Eric read the email, looked at the warning signs again, and then looked at me. Something passed across his face. Not quite approval, but understanding. Okay, he said. Stay here. He walked over to where Deputy Chen was finishing with Brenda. They spoke in low voices for a minute, both of them occasionally glancing at the warning signs. Then Eric came back. Collins, he said, and his voice had shifted to official mode. Based on the evidence, this appears to be a case of a driver ignoring posted warnings on private property where they did not have permission to be. Ms. Mallory has admitted she was on her phone while driving. The trench is legal agricultural infrastructure and the warnings are adequate. You're not at fault here. Behind him, Brenda made a sound like a wounded animal. What? No, he built that thing to trap me. You can't just let him. Ms. Mallory, Deputy Chen said firmly, this is private property. You did not have permission to be here. There are clear warning signs. You've admitted you were distracted while driving. Mr. Collins has documentation showing you've trespassed repeatedly. If anyone has committed a crime here, it's you. The crowd at the fence line had grown to maybe 15 people. I saw phones recording, saw faces ranging from shock to satisfaction to anger. This was going to be all over social media in an hour. Eric stepped closer to me and lowered his voice. She's going to come after you. She's already talking about lawyers and lawsuits. You need to document everything from this point forward. And I mean everything. Already doing it, I said. He nodded. That's why you're going to win. 2 weeks after the accident, I got a certified letter from a law firm in Houston. Brenda was suing me for $15,000 in damages, claiming I'd intentionally constructed a hazardous trap on what she called a commonly used access route. The letter was 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to one threat. Settle now or face us in court. I called a property attorney named Martin Reeves, who had an office in Bryan. He was 60 years old, mostly bald, and wore a bolo tie with his suit jacket. We met on a Tuesday afternoon, and I laid out everything I had. The property deed, the survey plat, the photos of my warning signs with timestamps, the trail camera footage showing 14 separate trespassing incidents, the email correspondence with the county extension office, the police report from the accident, and Deputy Harding's statement confirming the adequacy of my warnings. Spread it all out on his conference table and spent 20 minutes reviewing it in silence. Then he looked up at me and smiled. Mr. Collins, this is the most thoroughly documented case I've seen in 30 years of practice. You're not just going to win. You're going to destroy her. I don't want to destroy anyone, I said. I just want her to stay off my land. Then we'll file a countersuit, Martin said. Property damage for the destroyed hay crop, trespassing penalties, legal fees, and an injunction preventing her from coming within 500 feet of your property for 5 years. We'll ask for $12,000 in total. And I'll file a criminal complaint with the DA's office for repeated trespassing. It's a Class C misdemeanor, but it'll put her on record. The hearing was scheduled for October 15th at 10 a.m. in Brazos County Justice Court, with Judge Patricia Nguyen presiding. It was a small courtroom, maybe 40 seats for observers, but 25 of them were filled. Most were from Meadowbrook Estates, there to support Brenda. A handful were local farmers who'd heard about the case through the co-op grapevine. 2 reporters from the Bryan Eagle sat in the back row with notebooks. I wore a clean white button-down shirt, khaki pants, and my work boots. I wasn't trying to look like anything other than what I was. Martin sat next to me at the plaintiff's table, a leather folder open in front of him, documents arranged in neat stacks. Brenda sat at the defense table with her husband David, who was representing her. David Mallory was a corporate attorney from Houston, mid-50s, expensive suit, wedding ring that probably cost more than my truck. He looked uncomfortable. Corporate lawyers don't usually do trial work, and it showed in the way he kept shuffling his papers and adjusting his tie. Judge Nguyen entered, and we all stood. She was a small woman, with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun. She'd been a property attorney herself before taking the bench, and she had a reputation for having zero tolerance for nonsense. "We're here for Collins versus Mallory," she said, settling into her chair. "Mr. Reeves, you're the plaintiff. Let's hear your opening." Martin stood. He didn't walk around or gesture dramatically. He just stood at the table and spoke in a clear, calm voice. "This is a straightforward case about property rights. Mr. Collins owns 40 acres with a clear deed and no easements. Ms. Mallory repeatedly trespassed on his land for weeks, despite verbal warnings, and posted signage. When Mr. Collins constructed legal agricultural infrastructure with proper safety warnings, Ms. Mallory ignored those warnings and drove her vehicle into a clearly marked trench. She then attempted to blame Mr. Collins for her own negligence. We're asking for compensation for property damage, trespassing penalties, legal fees, and an injunction to prevent future violations. Judge Nguyen looked at David Mallory. Mr. Mallory, your response. David stood, cleared his throat. My client used what she believed to be an informal community access route for several weeks without objection. Mr. Collins then constructed what amounts to a vehicle trap without adequate warning, resulting in $8,500 in damage to my client's vehicle and significant emotional distress. We believe Mr. Collins acted with malicious intent, and we're asking the court to hold him liable. Informal community access route, Judge Nguyen repeated, her tone flat. On private property, without permission or easement. David hesitated. The absence of explicit prohibition can be interpreted as implicit permission under certain common law principles. Not in Texas. It can't, Judge Nguyen said. But continue. Mr. Reeves, present your evidence. Martin pulled out the first exhibit, the property deed, projected on a screen at the front of the courtroom. He walked the judge through it line by line. 40 acres, precise boundaries, no easements, no rights of way, recorded in 2017, clean title. Then came the trail camera footage. Martin played all 14 clips in sequence, each one showing the white Mercedes with license plate HOA CEO1 driving across my property. The timestamps ran from September 11th through September 25th. In every single clip, Brenda was clearly visible through the windshield, phone to her ear or coffee cup in hand, never slowing down, never stopping. The crowd in the courtroom murmured. Your Honor, Martin said, these clips establish a clear pattern of knowing, willful trespassing. Ms. Mallory was not lost. She was not confused. She was using Mr. Collins' private property as a shortcut to save time on her commute. Next came the photos of my warning signs. The first set from September 12th, showing the private property no trespassing sign I'd posted after the first incident, properly positioned. The second set from September 23rd, showing the danger open trench ahead signs, the yellow caution tape, and the orange traffic cones. Martin zoomed in on each image, showing the reflective surfaces, the bold lettering, the positioning 50 feet back from the trench edge. These warnings exceed Department of Transportation standards for construction zones, Martin said. They were visible from over 100 yards in daylight conditions. Any reasonable driver would have seen them and stopped. Then came my agricultural exemption certificate from Brazos County and the email from the Extension Office confirming my right to construct drainage improvements. Martin read the relevant passages aloud. The trench serves a legitimate agricultural purpose and requires no special permit. Mr. Collins was exercising his legal property rights. Finally, Martin played the video I'd recorded on the morning of the accident. The courtroom went completely silent. You could see everything. The Mercedes is approaching at high speed. Brenda is on her phone, not watching the road. The warning sign is clearly visible in the frame. Her sudden realization, the panic braking, the impact, the airbags are deploying. When it finished, Martin turned to face Brenda. Mallory, did you see the warning signs that morning? Brenda stood. She'd dressed carefully for court, a conservative navy dress and minimal jewelry, but her hands were shaking. I may have seen something, but I was focused on the road ahead. You just testified you were focused on the road, Martin interrupted. But the video shows you looking at your phone. I glanced at my phone for a second. While driving 40 miles per hour across someone else's property without permission. I didn't think it was a big deal. Brenda's voice rose. It was just empty land. Nobody was using it. It's not empty land, Martin said. It's a working hay farm. And you destroyed approximately 200 bales worth of crops with your repeated trespassing. That's $800 in damages. Did you ever ask Mr. Balmuhus or to Collins for permission to cross his property? No, but did you stop driving across his land after he asked you to? He was being unreasonable. And did you stop? Brenda's mouth opened and closed. Did you see the warning signs on September 25th? I don't remember. Martin rewound the video to the frame, showing Brenda's face at the moment she looked up from her phone. Her eyes were clearly focused on the warning sign, her expression showing recognition and alarm. He froze the image on the screen. "You don't remember seeing this sign that you're looking directly at in this frame. I was distracted, because you were on your phone while trespassing on private property at 40 miles per hour. Brenda sat down hard. Her face was red. David Mallory stood up. "Line of questioning is harassing my client." "Your client is contradicting her own testimony," Judge Nguyen said. "Sit down, Mr. Mallory." David tried to salvage the case by calling Brenda back to the stand and asking her about her intentions. She explained that she'd been using the route for weeks, that it saved time, that she'd checked county records and found no easement, so she assumed it was acceptable. She claimed she'd never seen my first warning sign, and that the trench warnings weren't adequate because they didn't specify the depth or exact location of the hazard. Martin stood for cross-examination. "Ms. Mallory, you testified you checked county records for easements. Did those records show who owned the property?" "Yes, Mr. Collins." "And did you ever contact Mr. Collins to ask permission to cross his property?" "No." "Why not?" Brenda hesitated. "I didn't think I needed to. It was just an empty field." "But you knew it was his property?" "Yes. And you knew he'd asked you to stop after you met at your home." "He was hostile. Did he threaten you?" "No. But his tone. Did he use profanity or raise his voice?" "No. He simply asked you to stop trespassing, and you decided to ignore him." Brenda didn't answer. The silence stretched out for 5 seconds. Judge Nguyen leaned forward. "Ms. Mallory, answer the question." "I didn't think he'd actually do anything about it," Brenda said quietly. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Nguyen hit her gavel once. "Order." Martin returned to his table. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Nguyen didn't recess to deliberate. She sat back in her chair, looked at the papers in front of her, and then looked at Brenda. "Miss Mallory, I've been a judge for 12 years and a property attorney for 20 before that. This is one of the clearest cases of willful trespassing I've ever seen. You knowingly and repeatedly violated Mr. Collins's property rights. You ignored verbal warnings, written warnings, and posted safety signage. You've admitted under oath that you continued trespassing because you didn't believe there would be consequences. That's not a legal defense. That's entitlement." She picked up her pen and started writing. "Judgment for the plaintiff. Mrs. Mallory, you are ordered to pay Mr. Collins $12,300 for property damages, trespassing penalties, and legal fees. You are enjoined from entering within 500 feet of Mr. Collins' property for a period of 5 years. Violation of this injunction will result in contempt of court charges." She looked up. "Additionally, I'm forwarding the evidence in this case to the county district attorney for review of criminal trespassing charges. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down. Half the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The other half, mostly the farmers, broke into applause. Brenda sat frozen at the defense table, her face white. David was already packing up his briefcase, not looking at anyone. Martin leaned over to me. "That's about as clean a win as you can get." I nodded, but I didn't feel triumphant. "It was never about winning," I said. "It was about boundaries." And we stood up and walked out of the courtroom. Behind us, I could hear Brenda crying and the murmur of the Meadowbrook residents trying to console her. The reporters were already typing on their phones. By evening, this would be all over the local news, outside on the courthouse steps. Martin shook my hand. "You did everything right. People like Brenda Mallory think rules don't apply to them until someone proves otherwise. You proved it." I thanked him and walked to my truck. The October sun was warm on my shoulders. The sky was clear blue. Somewhere back on my farm, the trench I'd dug was already filling with rainwater from the storms we'd had last week, doing exactly what I'd designed it to do, providing drainage, protecting my land, and keeping people who didn't respect boundaries on their own side of the fence. 2 weeks after the court ruling, the Brazos County District Attorney filed criminal charges against Brenda Mallory, Class C misdemeanor for criminal trespass. It carried a maximum fine of $500 and no jail time, but it meant a criminal record. Brenda's attorney negotiated a plea deal, 6 months probation, 40 hours of community service, and a $500 fine. She accepted it without going to trial. I heard about it through Martin Reeves, who called me on a Thursday afternoon to let me know it was done. She's on the record now. If she ever tries anything like this again, anywhere, it'll escalate to a Class B. I don't think she will, I said, and I meant it. The fight had gone out of Brenda Mallory the moment Judge Nguyen brought down that gavel. A week later, I got an email from someone I didn't know, a resident of Meadowbrook Estates named Tom Chen. He wrote that there had been an emergency HOA board meeting and that 14 of the 18 board members had voted to remove Brenda as president. The email included a copy of her resignation letter. It was short and formal. Due to recent legal matters, I am stepping down as HOA president effective immediately. I apologize for any disruption this may have caused our community. Tom's email ended with a line that surprised me. None of us didn't know what was really happening until the court case. Thank you for standing up for your property rights. It reminded some of us why we moved out here in the first place. I read the Brian Eagles coverage of the story online. The headline read, "Local HOA President Fined, Resigns After Trespassing Judgment." The article was factual and straightforward, quoting Judge Nguyen's ruling and Deputy Harding's statement. There was a photo of the courthouse and a smaller photo of my property taken from the county road. The comments section was split. Half the people praised the ruling and talked about property rights. The other half said I'd been vindictive and should have just let it go. I didn't read past the first page. It didn't matter what strangers thought. What mattered was that my boundary was finally being respected. I used part of the judgment money to build a proper gate at the main entrance to my property. 12 feet wide, steel frame, electric lock operated by a keypad. I mounted a wooden sign above it that read, "Collins Farm, established 2017, private property." It wasn't fancy, but it was clear. Then I hired a surveyor to come out and remark my property lines with fresh stakes and orange tape. I wanted there to be no ambiguity, no confusion, no excuses. While the surveyor worked, I filled in the trench. It had served its purpose. The rainy season was coming, and I didn't need a vehicle trap sitting in the middle of my pasture. I used the excavator to push the dirt back in, compacted it with the bucket, and seeded it with winter rye grass. By spring, it would be green and level, like the trench had never existed. The last thing I did was plant a row of cedar trees along the eastern boundary, where my land met Meadowbrook Estates. 20 trees, evenly spaced, each one about 3 feet tall. They'd grow slowly over the years, eventually forming a natural fence line that would be visible from both sides. It wasn't about blocking the view. It was about marking the line. This far, and no further. I spent a Saturday afternoon digging holes and setting the saplings, watering each one carefully, packing the soil tight around the roots. The work was quiet and repetitive, and satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with winning or losing. On Thanksgiving, I invited a few people over for a small gathering. Deputy Eric Harding and his wife, Martin Reeves, a couple of farmers from the co-op who'd supported me through the whole ordeal. We grilled burgers and drank beer and talked about everything except Brenda Mallory. At one point, Eric raised his bottle and said, "Ray, you taught me something this year. Sometimes the system actually works, but only if you know how to use it." I clinked my bottle against his and didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. The system had worked because I documented everything, followed every rule, and refused to let anger make my decisions for me. That was the lesson. Not that justice always wins, but that preparation and patience give justice a fighting chance. As the sun set and people started heading home, I stood by the new gate and looked out over my land. The cedar saplings were barely visible in the fading light, thin green silhouettes against the darker grass. The pasture was healing where the tire tracks had torn through it. The trench was gone, filled and seeded, and already sprouting new growth. Everything was returning to the way it should be. Quiet, ordered, respected. I heard a car engine in the distance, somewhere on the county road, and for a split second my shoulders tensed. Then I relaxed. It wasn't my problem anymore. Whoever it was, they were on the road where they belonged, and I was on my land where I belonged. The boundary was clear, the fence line was marked, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe easy. Spring came early the following year. By March, the ryegrass I'd seeded over the filled trench had sprouted thick and green, and you couldn't tell there had ever been a scar across that section of pasture. The cedar saplings along the eastern boundary had grown maybe 6 inches, their branches filling out with new growth. They weren't tall enough yet to provide real privacy, but they marked the line clearly. Anyone looking from either side would know exactly where my property ended and Meadowbrook Estates began. I was standing near the gate one Saturday morning, coffee in hand, when a young couple pulled up in a Honda Civic. They got out and looked around, clearly interested in something. I walked over. The man was maybe 30, wearing a weekend flannel and jeans. The woman had a baby in a carrier strapped to her chest. They smiled when they saw me. "Are you Mr. Collins?" the man asked. "I am," I said. "We're looking at the property next door," he said, pointing north toward a 40-acre parcel that had been for sale since January. "The realtor mentioned you farm hay. We wanted to know what it's like living out here. We're trying to get away from HOA restrictions and just have some space." I looked at them for a moment. They seemed genuine, tired of rules and looking for freedom, same as I'd been 8 years ago. "It's quiet," I said. "The work is honest. The neighbors mostly keep to themselves, and your property is your property. Nobody tells you what color to paint your mailbox." The woman laughed. "That sounds perfect." Glanced toward Meadowbrook Estates. "We heard there was some kind of dispute last year. Is that something we should worry about?" "It's resolved," I said. "The boundary is clear now. As long as you respect other people's land and expect them to respect yours, you'll be fine out here." They thanked me and drove off. I watched them go and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe, or just satisfaction that the next generation moving into this area understood what boundaries meant. Not walls or hostility, just mutual respect. You stay on your side, I stay on mine, and we all get along fine. A few weeks later, I heard through the co-op grapevine that Brenda and David Mallory had sold their house in Meadowbrook and moved back to Houston. I didn't know if it was because of the judgment, or the resignation, or just the weight of being the person everyone whispered about at neighborhood barbecues. It didn't matter. She was gone, and that chapter was closed. I never saw her white Mercedes on my property again. I never saw it anywhere. The county sent me a renewal notice for my agricultural exemption in April. I filled it out, attached the updated photos of my hay operation, and mailed it back. A week later, I got a letter confirming approval for another year. "Thank you for your continued contribution to Brazos County agriculture," it said. I pinned it to the bulletin board in my barn next to the photo of Sarah and my old engineering certificate. 3 pieces of paper that told the story of who I'd been and who I'd become. One evening in late April, I sat on the porch of my barn and watched the sun go down over the pasture. The sky turned orange and pink, and the shadows stretched long across the grass. The cedar trees swayed gently in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a tractor running, probably one of my neighbors finishing evening chores. It was the sound of a working landscape, a place where people lived by the rhythms of the land and the seasons, and the simple rules that made rural life possible. Respect the fence line, keep your word, don't take what isn't yours. I thought about the tire tracks that had started all of this, the 2 parallel ruts that had cut across my pasture like a violation. They were gone now, erased by time and rain and new growth. The land had healed itself the way land always does, if you give it time and care. And I'd healed too, in a way. Not from anger, because I'd never really been angry. Disbelief that someone could look at a clear boundary and decide it didn't apply to them. I understood now that some people would always test the limits, always push to see what they could get away with, and the only answer to that was to hold the line, firmly, legally, without apology. I finished my coffee and stood up. The stars were starting to come out, bright and sharp in the Texas sky. I walked inside, closed the door, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow, I'd start cutting the first hay of the season, but tonight, I was just a man on his own land, at peace with his choices, content with his boundaries. And that was enough. Sometimes the best revenge is just standing your ground and letting the system do its job. If this story reminded you why boundaries matter, hit that subscribe button for Karma Fence. We share real stories about people who fought back the right way. Drop a comment telling us about a time you had to defend what was yours. And if you know someone dealing with a boundary bully right now, share this with them. They need to know they're not alone.